When did you realize your parents had completely lost the plot? I was 16, standing on the roof of our garage with a bottle of vodka, while my mom cheered from below, yelling at me to jump into the pool. "Try to break your arm," she said, pointing to the scar on her elbow. "You can do it." Mom and Dad were completely obsessed with the idea that they were perfect people who'd lived perfect lives. Every mistake they'd ever made was actually a necessary step in becoming who they were today. So they expected us to make the exact same decisions at the exact same ages. Stupid mistakes, like drunk jumping into a pool, included. When my older brother Adam was born, Dad sat down and wrote out his entire life story year by year like a manual for him to follow. When Adam turned 7, Dad made him start playing baseball even though Adam hated sports, because that's what Dad did. When Adam was 9, Dad made him get in a fight with a kid at school just like he had. He was delighted when Adam got his nose broken because Dad had broken his too, and that's where he developed his fighting spirit and can-do attitude. Mom did the same thing to me and my sister Cece. She had this massive timeline of her life on the wall of her office with photos and journal entries and newspaper clippings. When I turned 13, she sat me down and said, "This is your instruction manual for becoming a woman." I asked what happened if I didn't want to do something she did, and she said, "Then you'll become a worse version of what you could be." And I refused to raise inferior daughters. The tracking started immediately. Mom made me cut my hair into this horrible bob because that's when she got one. I had to quit the soccer team I loved because Mom never played sports. At 14, she made me start smoking cigarettes because she'd started at 14. And even though she quit at 23, she said those 9 years taught her about addiction and self-control. I had to fail algebra on purpose because Mom failed algebra. When I said that was going to ruin my GPA, she said, "I failed algebra and I turned out fine. So clearly failing algebra is part of becoming fine." Adam had it even worse. When he turned 14, Dad dragged him to a tattoo shop and made him get a skull on his shoulder because Dad got one at 14 and now regretted it. Dad said, "You need to experience the regret of a bad tattoo to understand permanent consequences." When Adam was 15, Dad made him total his car on purpose by driving it into a ditch because Dad had done the same thing and said it taught him to respect vehicles. Adam walked away with a concussion, and Dad just celebrated like it was some huge accomplishment. Cece had to pierce her own ears with a sewing needle at 12 because that's what Mom did, and they got so infected she ended up in the emergency room. The worst was the roof incident. On Mom's 16th birthday, she got drunk at a party and jumped off a garage roof into a pool and broke her collarbone. She talked about it constantly like it was this pivotal character-building moment. So on my 16th birthday, she threw me a party, got me drunk, and told me I had to jump off our garage into our pool. I was terrified. I told her I didn't want to do it, and she said, "I was scared too, but I did it anyway, and that's what made me brave." I stood up there looking down at the pool while my friends stared and Mom filmed it yelling encouragement. I kept thinking about her broken collarbone and how I could die if I landed wrong. But everyone was watching and Mom was getting impatient. So I jumped. I missed the pool completely and landed on the concrete patio. I broke my leg in 3 places and fractured my hip. At the hospital, Mom seemed annoyed that I'd messed it up. She said, "I landed in the pool just fine, so you must not have committed to it fully." The doctors asked what happened, and Mom lied and said I'd been horsing around. When we got home, she made me look at x-rays of my injuries next to her old x-rays and said, "See, we both have proof we survived our 16th birthdays." I told my school counselor everything the next day, about the smoking and the failed classes and the jump and all of it. She called CPS and they removed me and Cece and Adam from the house. We stayed with my aunt for 3 months, and it was the first time in my life I could just be myself. I joined the soccer team again. I quit smoking. I started getting good grades. Adam stopped having nightmares about the car crash. Cece's ears finally healed. Then Mom and Dad showed up at court with a lawyer and boxes of evidence. They had their timelines and journals and photos proving that everything they made us do, they'd done first. Their lawyer argued that parents have the right to raise their children according to their own values and life experiences. They brought in a psychologist who testified that modeling behavior for children is normal parenting. Mom said she was just trying to give us the gift of her wisdom. Dad said Adam was becoming soft without his guidance. The judge looked uncomfortable but said that while the methods were unconventional, parents do have the right to set expectations for their children. We got sent back home that night. Mom pulled out her timeline and pointed to age 16 and a half. She smiled at me and said, "At this age, I got pregnant with my first boyfriend, so I guess we need to get you a boyfriend pretty quickly." We walked through the front door and Mom didn't even wait for us to put our bags down before she headed straight to her office. I heard her footsteps on the hardwood floor and then she called my name. When I got there, she was standing in front of the timeline wall with her arms crossed. She tapped a specific entry with her finger, the one marked 16. 5 years, pregnant with first boyfriend, in her neat handwriting. She looked at me with this bright smile like she was announcing something exciting. She told me we needed to find a suitable senior boy within 2 weeks so I could stay on schedule. I just stood there feeling my stomach drop. She kept talking about how important this milestone was and how it shaped everything that came after in her life. I nodded and said okay, because what else could I do with Dad standing right behind me in the doorway? I went to my room and closed the door and lay down on my bed staring at the ceiling. The judge's words kept playing in my head about how parents have rights to raise their kids according to their own values. But this wasn't about values. Forcing me to get pregnant at 16 wasn't parenting. It was something else entirely. I made myself a promise right there that I wouldn't let them control my body no matter what they did. I didn't know how I'd stop them yet, but I knew I had to figure something out. The ceiling had these old water stains that looked like continents, and I traced them with my eyes while my mind raced through possibilities. After midnight, I heard a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Adam standing there looking tired and scared. He jerked his head toward his room and I followed him down the hall. When we got inside, Cece was already sitting on his floor with her knees pulled up to her chest. We kept our voices to whispers. Adam said we needed to talk about what just happened at court and what Mom announced. Cece started crying quietly, and I sat down next to her and put my arm around her shoulders. Adam said we couldn't do any more dangerous stunts like the roof jump or the car crash. We all agreed on that. Then he suggested we should figure out which timeline requirements were coming up next so we'd know what to watch for. I pulled out my phone and we started making a list of the things we remembered from our parents' timelines. It was a long list. By the time we finished, it was almost 2 a.m, and we were all exhausted and scared. The next morning at breakfast, Mom was already at the table when I came downstairs. She had her coffee and a pack of cigarettes sitting next to her plate. As soon as I sat down, she slid a cigarette across the table toward me. I looked at it and shook my head. I told her I was trying to quit. Her face changed and she got this tight look around her mouth. She said I needed to relearn discipline. She said her timeline wasn't optional and I'd understood that before we went to court. She pushed the cigarette closer to my plate and waited. I could feel Dad watching from the kitchen doorway. I picked up the cigarette and put it in my pocket and told her I'd smoke it later. She didn't look happy about that, but she let it go. At the school, I was walking to my locker when my counselor, Pooja Moss, appeared in the hallway. She touched my arm gently and asked how things went at court. I could tell from her face that she already knew it didn't go well. We stood there by the lockers while kids rushed past us to class. I started explaining about coming home and Mom immediately announcing the pregnancy timeline. I watched Pooja's face go pale. Her hand tightened on the folder she was carrying. She asked me to come to her office during lunch to give her specific details she could write down. She said she needed dates and exact words if I could remember them. I said I'd be there. She squeezed my shoulder and walked away quickly toward the counseling office. That evening, I was in my room doing homework when I heard the house phone ring downstairs. I heard Dad answer it. There was a long pause, and then his voice got loud. I crept to the top of the stairs to listen. I could only hear Dad's side, but I knew it was Aunt Claire. He said something about stopping interference with the family. Then he said it again louder. Then he just hung up mid-sentence while she was still talking. I heard him walk across the living room and there was a yanking sound and then the phone got unplugged from the wall. I heard a drawer open and close. I went back to my room before he could catch me listening. The next day after school, I took the bus to a different neighborhood and found a health store. I walked around looking at vitamins and protein powder until I was sure nobody was watching. Then I found the section with herbal cigarettes that look real but don't have tobacco. I bought 3 packs with money I'd saved from my birthday. The cashier didn't ask any questions. When I got home, I put the herbal ones in my backpack and hid the real packs Mom kept giving me in the back of my closet behind some old shoes. That way Cece wouldn't find them and try to smoke them. When Mom watched me smoke, I could use the fake ones and she wouldn't know the difference. 2 days later, Mom called me into her office after dinner. She told me to stand in front of the timeline wall. She pointed at different photos and journal entries about her first boyfriend. She said his name was Derek and he was 18 when they started dating. She was 16. They dated for 4 months. She explained every detail like she was giving me instructions for a project. She said I had until Thanksgiving to find someone similar. Then she said I needed to start the process that would lead to pregnancy by March. She kept using the word process like it was something clinical and planned. I stood there nodding and trying not to throw up. She showed me pictures of Derek and described his personality and what kind of car he drove. When she finally let me leave, I went straight to the bathroom and locked the door. Late that night, when everyone was asleep, I took my phone and went to Mom's office. I turned on just the desk lamp so it wouldn't be too bright. I photographed every section of the timeline wall. I made sure to get clear shots of the pregnancy entry and all her handwritten notes about necessary life experiences. I took photos of the journal pages on her desk that mentioned Derek. I took photos of everything I could find that documented what she was planning. Then I went back to my room and dug through my desk drawer until I found my hospital discharge papers from the roof jump. I made copies on the printer in the hallway and hid them inside my math textbook between the pages about quadratic equations. The next morning, I woke up to Dad yelling outside. I went to the window and saw him making Adam come out to the yard. Dad called it toughness drills, but it was really just shoving Adam around and making him try to stay on his feet. I watched Adam's hands shaking even as he tried to stand firm and take the hits. His face was pale and he kept flinching before Dad even touched him. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and felt sick knowing Dad actually thought this was helping Adam become a man. After about 20 minutes, Dad finally let Adam go back inside. Adam walked past my room without looking at anyone, and I heard his door close quietly. That evening at dinner, Mom set down her fork and looked straight at me. She said she'd been doing research and identified 3 senior boys who might work as boyfriend candidates. The first one was named Tyler, and he had third period free when I had study hall. The second was Marcus, who stayed late for basketball practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The third was someone named Ethan, who worked at the coffee shop on weekends. She pulled out a folded paper with their class schedules written in her neat handwriting. She pointed at Tyler's name and suggested I could engineer a meeting by going to the library during study hall when he'd be there. My stomach twisted into a hard knot as I realized she wasn't just planning this. She was actively trying to make my pregnancy happen on her exact timeline. I nodded and said, okay, even though every part of me wanted to scream. Dad asked if I understood the importance of following the path, and I said yes. Mom smiled and told me she'd help me pick out clothes that would get Tyler's attention. After dinner, I went straight to my room and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. I kept thinking about March and how that was only 5 months away. The next morning at the school, I went to study hall like always. I pulled out a notebook and stared at the blank page for a long time. Then I started writing down everything I actually wanted for myself. I wrote soccer at the top because that was the thing I missed most. Then I wrote math and science because I used to be good at those before Mom made me fail algebra. I wrote maybe college even though I didn't know what I'd study. I wrote definitely not a baby at 16 in all capital letters. I wrote I want to choose my own life at the bottom. I looked at the list and felt something break open in my chest. I tore the page out carefully and folded it into a small square. Then I walked to the back of the library where nobody ever went. I found a thick book about ancient Rome on the bottom shelf and slid my folded paper inside between 2 random pages. It felt like leaving proof that the real me existed somewhere even if nobody could see her at home. After school, I was walking to the bus when someone called my name. I turned around and saw Pooja standing by the counseling office door. She waved me over and I followed her inside. She closed the door and sat down at her desk. She told me she'd been thinking about my situation a lot. She said she wanted to set up a system where I could come talk to her anytime without my parents knowing. She pulled out a stack of hall passes and explained she'd created fake tutoring sessions and study groups as excuses. If I needed to see her, I could just use one of the passes and come to her office. She promised everything I told her would stay private unless there was immediate danger. I asked what counted as immediate danger, and she said anything involving harm to me or my siblings. I thanked her and took 3 of the hall passes to keep in my backpack. On Saturday morning, Mom came into my room early. She told me to get up because we were going to the coffee shop near school. I asked why, and she said she'd arranged for me to accidentally run into Ethan. She laid out an outfit on my bed, a blue sweater and jeans that she said looked approachable. She told me to be open-minded and remember this was about following the path that made her who she is today. I got dressed slowly and followed her to the car. At the coffee shop, she made me go in alone while she waited outside. I ordered a drink and sat at a table trying to look normal. A guy in an apron came over to wipe down the table next to mine. Mom had shown me his picture, so I knew it was Ethan. He smiled and said hi. I said hi back. He asked if I went to the high school and I said yes. Then his manager called him back to the counter and he left. I sat there for 20 more minutes and then went back to the car. Mom asked how it went and I said fine. She seemed satisfied. Monday morning, I went straight to Pooja's office before first period. I used one of the hall passes even though I didn't need to yet. She let me in and I sat down in the chair across from her desk. I told her everything about the pregnancy timeline. I explained the specific deadline of March and how Mom was actively trying to match me with senior boys. I showed her the paper with their schedules that Mom had made. Pooja's face got very serious. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing everything down with dates and times. She asked me to repeat certain parts, so she could get the details right. Then she set down her pen and looked at me. She said she had to report this because what Mom was planning counted as sexual coercion of a minor. I felt a tiny spark of hope mixed with fear about what would happen when my parents found out. That afternoon, I was in Pooja's office again. She had her phone on speaker and was talking to someone named Dean. I recognized his voice from when CPS came to our house before. Pooja explained the new developments and read from her notes about the pregnancy timeline and the matchmaking. Dean's voice sounded tired, but he said the case was still technically open for monitoring. He said this information meant he needed to schedule another home visit. He asked if Friday would work, and Pooja said yes. After she hung up, I asked if my parents would know I told. She said they'd know someone reported new concerns, but not necessarily who. 2 days later, the house phone rang during dinner. Dad answered it, and his face went hard. He listened for maybe 30 seconds and then said Friday would be fine. After he hung up, he told us Dean was coming for a follow-up visit. Mom immediately stood up and started clearing dishes even though we weren't done eating. She spent the next 2 days cleaning everything. She made me dust her office, including the timeline wall. She made Adam organize the garage. She made Cece clean her room until it looked like nobody lived there. Thursday night, Dad sat us all down in the living room. He made us rehearse what we'd say when Dean came. We had to practice saying we were happy to be home. We had to practice saying we were learning so much from their guidance. We had to practice smiling and acting normal. Thursday morning before school, I did something risky. I went to Mom's office and found her sitting at her desk. I asked her to explain the pregnancy timeline one more time because I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. She seemed pleased that I was taking it seriously. She talked for almost 10 minutes about how getting pregnant at 16 and a half taught her responsibility and purpose. She said it forced her to grow up and become the woman she was meant to be. The whole time she talked, I had my phone in my pocket recording everything. She never noticed. After she finished, I thanked her and went to the school. In the bathroom, I saved the audio file in 3 different places: my phone, my email, and a cloud storage app I downloaded. That same day, something else happened. I didn't know about it until later, but Aunt Claire went to the courthouse. She filed paperwork requesting temporary guardianship of all 3 of us. A judge looked at her request and assigned someone called a guardian ad litem to investigate. The person's name was Rowan Benedict. Her job was to represent our interests and figure out what was actually best for us. Dean called Pooja that afternoon to tell her about it. He said it was a positive development because it meant our voices would be heard separately from our parents. Friday during lunch, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said hello and asked if this was me. I said yes. She introduced herself as Rowan Benedict and said Pooja had given her my number. She explained that she was a guardian ad litem, which meant her job was to figure out what was best for me and my siblings. She said I'd get to talk to a judge privately about what I wanted to happen. She asked if I had time to talk, and I said yes, even though lunch was almost over. She asked me basic questions about school and home and how I was doing. I gave short answers because other students were around. She said she'd call again soon and we'd have a longer conversation. After we hung up, I sat there holding my phone and feeling like maybe things were finally starting to move in a direction that didn't involve following Mom's timeline. That evening, Mom knocked on my bedroom door and told me to come to the living room for what she called a health chat. I sat on the couch while she pulled out a notebook and opened it to a page with dates and numbers written all over it. She explained that at 16 she'd tracked her menstrual cycle very carefully, because understanding fertility was important for women. She asked me when my last period started and how long my cycles usually lasted. I gave vague answers like, around 3 weeks ago, and pretty regular, I think, while she wrote everything down. She asked if I experienced cramping and how heavy my flow was, and whether I'd noticed any changes in the past year. Each question felt like she was mapping out my body without permission. She said she wanted me to start tracking my cycle in a journal, just like she had, because it would help me understand my fertility window. I nodded and said, okay, even though I had no intention of giving her that information. She talked for almost 20 minutes about ovulation and timing, and how she got pregnant with Adam because she understood her body. The whole time I made mental notes of every invasive thing she said, so I could tell Pooja later. When she finally finished, she patted my hand and said we'd have these chats regularly, now that I was at the right age for this kind of guidance. The next morning, I waited until Mom left for work, and then called my doctor's office from my cell phone in the bathroom. The receptionist answered, and I asked if I could get copies of my medical records from when I broke my leg last year. She said I'd need a parent's signature on the release form since I was under 18. I told her it was for a school project about personal health history, and my teacher needed documentation of a major injury. She sounded skeptical but said she'd check with the office manager. I texted Pooja during first period and explained what I was trying to do. She responded that she had a counseling appointment scheduled with me for Wednesday afternoon, and we could say I needed the records for college applications or something official sounding. She said she'd call the doctor's office herself and arrange it so my parents wouldn't find out. By lunch, she'd texted me that it was all set up and I could pick up the records during our appointment on Wednesday. Sunday night, I was in my room doing homework when I heard Dad call Adam downstairs. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. Dad told Adam it was time for another tattoo to commemorate a regret, just like the original timeline required. He said he'd already made an appointment at the tattoo shop for Tuesday afternoon. Adam's voice came out quiet but steady. He said no, he wasn't getting another tattoo. The house went completely silent. I held my breath waiting for Dad to explode, but instead he just asked what Adam meant. Adam repeated that he wasn't getting another tattoo, and he wasn't following that part of the timeline anymore. Dad's voice got louder, asking who Adam thought he was to refuse a timeline requirement. Adam said he was someone who didn't want more tattoos he'd regret. Dad started yelling about disrespect and soft generation, and how Adam was throwing away the gift of his guidance. Mom came out of her office asking what was happening. Dad told her Adam was refusing the tattoo, and Mom's face went pale. She asked Adam if he understood what this meant, and Adam just nodded. Dad stormed out the front door, and we heard his car start and peel out of the driveway. After Dad left, I went to Adam's room and found Cece already sitting on his floor. Adam was shaking a little, but he looked relieved. We whispered about what just happened and agreed it was the first time any of us had refused a timeline requirement so directly. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I said we needed a way to get help fast if things got dangerous. Cece suggested we create some kind of emergency signal. Adam pulled out his phone and said we should all save Aunt Claire's number under a fake name, so our parents wouldn't know we had it. I saved it as Pizza Place in my contacts. Adam saved it as Gym. Cece saved it as Library. Then Adam said we needed a code word that would tell Aunt Claire to come get us immediately or call the police. I suggested Timeline since it was something we'd never normally text to her. We all agreed and practiced sending the test message and deleting it. Adam made us promise we'd only use it in a real emergency when we actually needed help right away. We sat there for a while not saying much, just knowing we'd crossed some kind of line tonight. The rest of the week passed in tense silence. Dad barely spoke to Adam. Mom kept giving me meaningful looks like she was disappointed I hadn't defended the timeline system. Friday afternoon, Dean showed up for the scheduled home visit. My parents transformed instantly into charming hosts. Mom made tea and brought out cookies. She sat with Dean at the dining room table and explained their parenting philosophy as experiential teaching where children learn by living through the same formative experiences their parents survived. She made it sound reasonable and thoughtful. Dad talked about how important it is to pass down wisdom through shared experiences rather than just lectures. Dean nodded and took notes without showing what he was thinking. He asked us a few questions about school and activities. We all gave the rehearsed answers about being happy to be home and learning so much. Dean stayed for almost an hour asking gentle questions and observing how we interacted. When he left, he thanked my parents for their time and said he'd file his report within a few days. After Dean's car pulled away, Dad's face changed. He said we hadn't been enthusiastic enough during the visit, and we needed to remember that CPS was looking for reasons to interfere. As punishment, he assigned us timeline chores. Adam had to clean out the garage and organize Dad's old baseball equipment. Cece had to go through Mom's jewelry and polish everything. I had to reorganize Mom's office, including dusting the timeline wall. I went upstairs with a cloth and furniture polish. The timeline wall took up the entire back wall of the office with photos and journal entries and newspaper clippings arranged by year. While I dusted each section, I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture the pregnancy entry and the entries about the roof jump and the cigarettes. Mom's journal from when she was 16 sat on the desk. I flipped through it and found pages where she'd written about getting pregnant and how scared she was, but also how it gave her purpose. I took photos of those pages too. I wrote down quotes in my phone's notes app like, "Getting pregnant at 16. 5 was the making of me." And Derek didn't stay, but the experience taught me everything about sacrifice. I made sure to put everything back exactly how I found it, so she wouldn't know I'd been documenting. Monday morning, I went straight to Pooja's office before first period. She closed the door and pulled out an official form with the school letterhead. She said she was completing a mandated reporter statement focusing specifically on the sexual coercion risk of the pregnancy timeline. She asked me to confirm the details about Mom's deadline and her active matchmaking. I told her everything, including the coffee date Mom tried to arrange and the health chat about fertility. Pooja wrote it all down with exact dates and times. When she finished, she made 2 copies. She gave one to me and told me to keep it somewhere safe where my parents wouldn't find it. She said she was storing the original in a locked cabinet in the counseling office. She explained that this statement would go to CPS and to Rowan, and it would be part of the official record about what was happening in our house. That same week, Aunt Claire was working on something too, though I didn't know all the details until later. She spent days going through papers and files from when we stayed with her. She found Adam's report card from those 3 months showing his grades had improved in every subject. She found the roster from my soccer team proving I'd rejoined. She gathered medical records from Cece's follow-up appointments showing her ear infections had completely cleared up after we left our parents' house. She wrote a statement describing our daily routines at her place and how we'd thrived with normal rules and freedom to make our own choices. She submitted everything to Rowan as evidence that we did better outside our parents' control. The following Tuesday, Rowan called and asked if she could interview me privately at the school. Pooja arranged for us to use an empty classroom during my free period. Rowan sat across from me at a student desk and said she wanted to hear everything in my own words. I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording of Mom explaining the pregnancy timeline. Rowan listened without interrupting. Then I showed her the photos of the timeline wall with the pregnancy entry clearly visible. I showed her the pictures of Mom's journal entries. I pulled out the hospital discharge papers from the roof jump that showed I'd broken my leg in 3 places and fractured my hip. Rowan looked at everything carefully and asked questions about dates and who was present and exactly what was said. She never looked shocked or horrified, just focused and professional. She took notes and made copies of everything I showed her. When we finished, she thanked me for being so thorough with documentation and said this would all be very important for the judge to see. Wednesday evening, Mom called me into the living room where she was sitting with her planner. She said she'd arranged for me to have coffee with the senior boy on Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. She'd already texted his mom to set it up. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my voice calm. I told her I had too much homework this weekend and my leg still hurt from the old injury when I walked too much. She got annoyed and said I was making excuses. I said I really couldn't do it this weekend and could we postpone? She stared at me for a long moment. Finally, she sighed and said fine, we'd reschedule for next weekend, but I needed to take this seriously because the timeline wasn't going to follow itself. Thursday after school, Pooja drove me to a health clinic 2 towns over where nobody would know my family. The building was small and plain with a parking lot half empty. We walked in together and Pooja waited in the lobby while I filled out forms using a fake name for my emergency contact. The nurse who called me back had gray hair and kind eyes and she didn't ask why I was there alone. She just explained the different birth control options and asked which one I wanted. I picked the pills because they were easiest to hide. She gave me a small paper bag with 3 months' worth and a pamphlet about taking them at the same time every day. I thanked her and left, and Pooja drove me home without asking any questions. That night, I hid the pills inside an old tampon box in my bathroom where Mom would never look. Friday evening, Dad came into my room and started going through my backpack looking for his phone charger. I watched him pull out folders and notebooks, and then he stopped and held up the clinic pamphlet I'd forgotten to throw away. He stared at it and then at me with this look on his face. I told him it was for a health class project about reproductive education, and we had to visit different medical facilities to learn about services. He kept looking at the pamphlet, and I could tell he didn't totally believe me, but he couldn't prove anything. He finally put it back in my bag and left without saying anything else. As soon as he was gone, I grabbed all my documentation from my backpack and my closet and my desk. I took the hospital records and the photos of the timeline wall and the audio recordings, and I put everything in a folder. Monday morning before school, I went to my locker and hid the folder behind my textbooks where my parents would never find it. During first period, my phone buzzed, and I saw Rowan's number. I asked to use the bathroom and called her back from the hallway. She explained that she was filing a motion for me to testify in camera, which meant I'd talk to the judge privately in his office without my parents there. She was also requesting interim protective orders that would ban Mom and Dad from making me do dangerous timeline requirements while the case was going on. She said the hearing would probably be scheduled within 2 weeks, and I needed to keep documenting everything. That afternoon, Dad told Adam to drive to the store to pick up groceries. Adam's face went white and he started breathing really fast like he couldn't get enough air. His hands shook so bad he dropped the car keys on the floor. Dad yelled at him to pick them up, and Adam just stood there breathing faster and faster with his whole body shaking. I pulled out my phone and started timing it while writing down everything I saw. The episode lasted 4 minutes before Adam finally calmed down enough to say he couldn't drive. Dad got mad and left to go to the store himself. I saved my notes with the time and date, so there was a record of how the forced car crash still messed Adam up. Tuesday morning, Mom caught me outside without a cigarette. She marched me back inside and made me sit at the kitchen table while she stood over me. She pulled out one of her real cigarette packs and put one in front of me and told me to smoke it right now. I lit it and took a few drags while she watched, and then she finally left. As soon as she was gone, I went outside and switched to my herbal cigarettes for the rest of the day. I kept the real pack she'd given me in my room so Cece wouldn't find it and try to smoke it. Wednesday evening, I was doing homework when I saw Mom posting on social media. She'd uploaded photos of our family doing activities together with a long caption about proud traditions and teaching children through experience. I screenshot everything, including the timestamps and all the comments from her friends saying how wonderful our family was. I sent the screenshots to Pooja, who said she'd forward them to Rowan and Dean. Thursday afternoon, my phone rang, and it was Rowan calling to say she'd filed her motion that morning. The court had scheduled a hearing for the following week. She reminded me I'd get to talk to the judge privately and explain exactly what was happening. She told me to be honest and specific without making anything sound bigger than it was. That night at dinner, Dad announced we were having family time without phones. He made all 3 of us hand over our phones, and he locked them in his desk drawer. I went to bed early and waited until I heard Mom and Dad's bedroom door close. Then I got up and pulled my old phone out from behind the books in my closet. I'd kept it charged just in case. I texted Aunt Claire and Pooja that I was okay, but communication might be hard for a while. Friday morning, someone sent an anonymous tip to the CPS hotline with a clip of my audio recording attached. I didn't know who did it, but I was glad someone had. That afternoon, Dean called the house and I heard Dad answer. Dean said he was doing an unannounced visit the next day. Dad's face got tight and Mom looked worried when he told her. I could tell they were scared about what Dean might find. Saturday afternoon, the doorbell rang and there was Dean standing on our porch without any warning. Mom tried to be friendly and offered him coffee, but he said he needed to see the whole house. She started giving him a tour and tried to skip her office, but Dean said he needed to see every room. He walked into her office and stopped in front of the timeline wall. He stood there for a long time reading all the entries with their dates and descriptions. Mom talked fast, explaining how it was just family history and tradition and a way to preserve memories. Dean didn't say anything. He just kept reading and taking notes, and I watched his face get more serious as he moved down the wall. He wrote notes for 15 minutes straight without saying anything. Then he asked to take photos of the wall, and Mom couldn't really say no. He photographed every section, zoomed in on the pregnancy entry, and took shots of her handwritten notes about necessary life experiences. Mom kept talking faster, trying to explain how it was just family tradition and a way to pass down wisdom, but Dean's face stayed serious and professional. He thanked her for the tour and said he'd be in touch. Then he left without the coffee she'd offered. After he drove away, Mom went straight to her office and closed the door, and I heard her on the phone with their lawyer talking in a low, worried voice. The following Monday morning, Dad woke Adam up early and told him it was time for fight practice. Adam tried to say he had homework, but Dad dragged him outside to the yard where a neighbor boy was already waiting. I watched from my window as Dad made them spar, pushing Adam harder every time he tried to back away. The neighbor kid landed punches on Adam's ribs, and Dad kept yelling at him to hit back, to show some spirit, to remember this was building character. Adam's face was red and he was breathing hard, but Dad wouldn't let him stop. After 20 minutes, Dad finally called it done, and Adam came inside holding his side. The next day at the school, I saw bruises all over his ribs and arms during gym class. During my counseling session with Pooja, I told her what happened, and she asked if Adam would let her take photos. I texted him, and he came to her office during his free period. Pooja documented every bruise with her phone, making sure to get clear shots that showed the extent of the damage. She added the photos to a file on her computer labeled with our last name and the current date. Tuesday during lunch, I sat in the library with a notebook and wrote out everything that had happened since we got sent back home. I described the pregnancy timeline, the cigarettes, the fight practice, all of it in detail with specific dates and times. At the end, I wrote that if anything happened to me, I wanted to live with Aunt Claire, and I listed her full name and phone number. I sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote, "Open if something happens to me" on the front in big letters. After lunch, I went to Pooja's office and handed her the envelope. She read what I'd written on the front, and her expression got sad but determined. She promised to keep it safe and locked it in her filing cabinet right next to the folder, with Adam's bruise photos, and all the other documentation she'd been collecting. Wednesday afternoon, Aunt Claire drove to meet Dean at his office. She brought a folder with photos of her house, copies of her work schedule, and a written plan for how she'd supervise all three of us. Dean looked through everything while she explained that she had a spare bedroom we could use, that she lived in the same school district, so we wouldn't have to change schools, and that her rules were based on safety and respect, instead of forcing us to copy someone else's life. She showed him Adam's improved report card from when we stayed with her before, my soccer team roster proving I'd rejoined, and medical records showing Cece's ear infections had cleared up completely. Dean took copies of everything and said he'd include it all in his next report to the court. Aunt Claire asked what else she could do to help, and he told her the best thing was to stay available and keep documenting how well we did when we were with her. Thursday morning, we all had to go to court for mediation. We sat in a conference room with my parents on one side of the table, and me, Adam, and Cece on the other side. Mom and Dad's lawyer was there, plus Dean and Rowan. The mediator asked my parents to explain their parenting approach, and Mom launched into this long speech about heritage and tradition, and how they were just trying to pass down the lessons that made them who they are. Dad talked about building character through experience, and said kids these days were too soft because parents protected them from everything. Then the mediator asked me to explain my perspective. I kept my voice calm and factual even though my hands were shaking under the table. I said I was afraid of what timeline requirement would come next, that I didn't want to get pregnant at 16, that I was scared of getting hurt again like I did jumping off the roof. I didn't cry or yell, I just stated the facts as clearly as I could. Adam talked about the car crash and how he still had nightmares. Cece showed the scars on her ears from the infected piercings. My parents kept saying we were misunderstanding their intentions, that everything they required was something they'd survived themselves, so it couldn't be that dangerous. During a break, Rowan pulled me aside into an empty hallway. She told me something she'd learned during her investigation, that Mom's own mother had used similar controlling methods on her when she was growing up. Mom had been forced to follow her grandmother's life timeline, just like we were being forced to follow Mom's. For a second, I felt this flash of sympathy, understanding that Mom learned this from her own childhood, and probably thought it was normal. But then I remembered the roof jump and the broken bones and the pregnancy deadline, and I knew that explanation didn't make it okay to do the same thing to us. Rowan seemed to read my face because she nodded and said that trauma can be passed down through generations, but that doesn't mean we have to accept it, or repeat it. Friday morning was the in-camera testimony, which meant I got to talk to the judge privately without my parents in the room. I sat in his office with just him, Rowan, and a court reporter who typed everything I said. The judge asked me to explain what was happening at home, and I pulled out my phone. I played the audio recording of Mom explaining the pregnancy timeline with all the specific details about getting pregnant by March. I showed him the photos of the timeline wall with the entries about dangerous activities. I presented my hospital records from the roof jump with the documentation of 3 broken bones and a fractured hip. I explained in detail about the pregnancy plan, the deadline Mom had set, and how she was actively trying to find me a senior boyfriend to make it happen. The judge listened carefully and asked clarifying questions about dates and times, and exactly what my parents had said. He asked if I felt safe at home, and I told him honestly that I didn't know what they'd make me do next. He asked what I wanted to happen, and I said I wanted to live with Aunt Claire where I could just be myself without following someone else's life story. That same afternoon, the judge issued interim safety orders. The orders said my parents couldn't require us to do any dangerous activities, that I had guaranteed access to the school counseling without interference, and that Dean had to do weekly monitoring visits to make sure we were okay. The orders didn't remove us from the home yet, but they created rules my parents had to follow or they'd be in contempt of court. Rowan explained that these were temporary protections while the case continued, and that the judge was taking the situation seriously, even if he wasn't ready to change custody yet. When we got home that evening, my parents read through the court orders and their faces were tight and angry, but they didn't say much. Mom put the papers on her desk and Dad went outside to mow the lawn even though it was almost dark. The next week, Mom told me I couldn't go to soccer practice. She said it was punishment for my court testimony and that I needed to learn there were consequences for going against the family. I pulled out my phone and showed her the section of the court order that guaranteed my access to the school activities. She read it twice, then called their lawyer while I stood there waiting. After a 10-minute conversation, she hung up and told me I could go to practice. I grabbed my gear and went to the field, and the whole time I was running drills, I felt stronger than I had in months. The court order was actually working, actually protecting me, and for the first time I believed maybe things could actually change. 2 days later at dinner, Dad announced he was taking Adam out to practice the ditch driving experience that was on his timeline. Adam put down his fork and said no, he wasn't doing it. Dad's face turned red and he started yelling about disrespect and disobedience, and how the court had no right to interfere with his parenting. Adam stayed calm and said the court order protected him from dangerous activities. Dad got louder, shouting that driving into a ditch taught him about consequences and Adam needed the same lesson. He was yelling so loud that the windows were shaking and I could see neighbors looking over from their yards. One of them pulled out their phone and I realized they were calling someone, probably the police. 10 minutes later, 2 police officers knocked on our front door. Dad answered and tried to act normal, but his face was still red from yelling. The officers said they'd received a call about a domestic disturbance, and they needed to do a welfare check. They came inside and talked to my parents first. Then they asked to speak to me and Adam separately. One officer took me into the kitchen while the other talked to Adam in the living room. I told him about the court orders and showed him the copy I kept on my phone. I explained that Dad had been trying to make Adam do something dangerous, and Adam had refused based on the protective orders. The officer wrote everything down in a notebook and said he was glad we knew our rights. He asked if we felt safe, and I said we did as long as the court orders were being followed. Before they left, both officers made sure Adam and I had the non-emergency number saved in our phones. They said to call anytime we felt unsafe or if our parents tried to violate the court orders. They wrote up an incident report noting the yelling and the prior CPS involvement, and they gave Dean's name to their supervisor so the report would get added to our case file. Monday morning, Rowan called me before school and said she was filing a motion for modification. She had the police report from Friday night and documents from Pooja showing Mom tried to ban me from soccer practice right after the judge issued the interim orders. Rowan said she was requesting an emergency hearing because my parents kept violating the court's instructions, and the behavior was getting worse instead of better. She asked if anything else had happened over the weekend, and I told her no. My parents had been quiet and tense, like they were planning something but hadn't acted yet. She said to keep documenting everything and call her immediately if either parent tried to force any timeline requirements on me or my siblings. That afternoon, Mom was waiting by my locker when school ended. She grabbed my arm and said we were going to coffee with the senior boy right now, that she'd already texted him and he was meeting us in 20 minutes. I pulled my arm away and told her clearly that I wasn't going anywhere with her. She got this look on her face like I'd slapped her and started saying I was ungrateful, and didn't understand that getting pregnant at 16 made her who she is today. I had my phone in my pocket already recording because I'd started doing that whenever I was alone with either parent. She kept talking about how the pregnancy taught her responsibility and purpose, and I was throwing away the chance to learn those same lessons. I let her finish, then I walked away and went straight to the bathroom. I sent the recording to Rowan before I even left the school building. Wednesday morning, Rowan called again and said the court scheduled an emergency hearing for Friday. She sounded satisfied, like things were moving the way she hoped they would. All the lawyers got notified and Dean submitted an updated report to the judge. Rowan told me Dean was recommending temporary placement with Aunt Claire because my parents kept trying to control us even with court orders in place. She said the hearing would probably take most of the morning, and I should be prepared for my parents to be upset when they heard the judge's decision. Friday, I stayed home from the school for the hearing. We all sat in the courtroom while the judge read through everything. He looked at the police report from the neighbor's call. He listened to the recording of Mom trying to force the coffee date. He reviewed Dean's report about the ongoing violations. Then he announced he was granting temporary guardianship to Aunt Claire starting immediately. My parents had to do supervised visits only, and they had to complete parenting classes and family therapy before any custody changes could even be considered. Mom started crying and Dad's face turned red, but neither of them said anything. The judge made it clear that if they violated the supervised visit rules or tried to contact us outside of approved times, they could lose visitation completely. That afternoon, Aunt Claire picked us up with our essential stuff. We'd packed bags that morning before the hearing just in case. The drive to her house took 40 minutes and nobody talked much. When we got there, she showed us our rooms. Adam got the spare bedroom upstairs, and Cece and I shared the bigger guest room with 2 beds. Aunt Claire sat us down in the kitchen and explained her house rules. She had a curfew of 10 on the school nights and midnight on weekends. We had to do chores like dishes and laundry and yard work. We had to be honest with her about where we were going and who we were with. Then she said the most important rule was that we got to make our own choices about activities and friends and future plans. She said she'd sign permission slips for anything reasonable, and she'd support whatever we wanted to do as long as it was safe and legal. The following week, I went to the athletic office and filled out all the forms to officially rejoin the soccer team. Aunt Claire signed everything without asking questions or comparing it to any timeline. Practice started that afternoon, and I ran drills with my teammates like I'd never left. Coach put me back in my old position and said I'd worked hard to stay in shape during the time off. Soccer became something I looked forward to every single day. It was a place where I was just a player working on skills and trying to score goals, not someone following a script written before I was born. 2 weeks later, we had our first supervised visit with Mom and Dad at a family services center. A social worker sat in the room with us the whole time. My parents seemed stiff and awkward, like they didn't know what to talk about without the timeline to guide the conversation. Mom asked about school, and I told her I was doing fine. Dad asked Adam about his classes, and Adam gave short answers. They showed us paperwork proving they'd enrolled in the required parenting classes and family therapy sessions. The visit lasted an hour, and we all left feeling weird and uncomfortable, but at least nobody yelled or tried to force us to do anything dangerous. Over the next month, CPS created a formal case plan with specific goals my parents had to meet. They had to complete 12 weeks of parenting classes. They had to attend family therapy twice a month. They had to demonstrate they understood why forcing us to recreate their experiences was harmful. Aunt Claire coordinated everyone's schedules and made sure we got to therapy appointments and supervised visits. Dean checked in with us every week to see how we were adjusting to living with Aunt Claire. He always asked if we felt safe and if our parents had tried to contact us outside of approved times, and we always said no. Everything was following the rules. At the school, I met with my guidance counselor to create a plan for fixing my grades. I'd failed algebra on purpose because Mom failed it, and now I needed to actually learn the material. The counselor set me up with tutoring 3 times a week after soccer practice. I started working through problems and asking questions and actually trying to understand the concepts, instead of just copying wrong answers. I also threw away the last pack of cigarettes Mom had given me. I found it in my backpack when I was cleaning out old stuff, and I walked straight to the trash can outside school and dropped it in. I didn't need to pretend to be addicted to something just because Mom thought smoking taught her about self-control. Adam started working with a therapist who helped people deal with bad experiences. She met with him twice a week, and they talked about the car crash Dad made him do. After a few sessions, she suggested he practice driving in empty parking lots with Aunt Claire to help him feel less scared. They went to the mall parking lot early on Sunday mornings when hardly anyone was there. Adam would drive slow circles around the empty spaces, while Aunt Claire sat in the passenger seat and reminded him he was safe. His nightmares about the crash started happening less often, maybe once a week instead of every night. One evening he told me he was beginning to think he might actually be okay someday, that maybe the crash didn't have to define the rest of his life. A week later, Aunt Claire took Cece to a professional piercing place across town. The woman who worked there wore gloves and used equipment that came sealed in plastic packages. She cleaned Cece's ears with something that smelled sharp and medicinal. The old scars from the sewing needle infection showed up as bumpy red marks on both earlobes. Aunt Claire took photos of them with her phone before the piercing happened. The woman marked dots on Cece's ears with a purple pen and showed her in the mirror to make sure the placement looked right. Then she used a hollow needle that was way different from the sewing needle Mom had made her use. Cece squeezed my hand, but she didn't cry. The woman put in small silver studs and explained how to clean them twice a day with saline solution. She gave Cece a printed sheet with instructions and said to come back if there was any redness or swelling. Over the next few weeks, Cece's ears healed perfectly without any infection or problems. The 3-month review hearing happened on a cold morning in November. We all sat in the same courtroom where the judge had granted temporary guardianship to Aunt Claire. Dean submitted a report showing that Mom and Dad had attended all their parenting classes and family therapy sessions. They'd followed all the visit rules and hadn't tried to contact us outside approved times. The judge read through the paperwork and looked at us sitting in the front row. He said guardianship would continue with Aunt Claire for 12 months. He noted that our parents were making progress, and he kept the supervised visits on the same schedule. He said if Mom and Dad completed the full program successfully, there might be a possibility of increased contact later. Then he closed the file and moved on to the next case. That night, I was in my room at Aunt Claire's house putting away clean laundry. I found an empty corkboard in the back of the closet behind some old shoes. I carried it to my desk and pinned up a single photo of me at soccer practice. In the picture, I'm smiling and covered in mud, and I look completely like myself. I stared at all the blank space around that one photo, knowing that whatever came next got to be my choice, my timeline, my life. And that's the wrap-up. I always try to turn these stories into something you can actually take away, even in small ways. Hopefully this one gave you a little clarity or motivation. Subscribe so the next one finds you right away.